Locked doors conceal secrets. Keyholes let us peek in at them. I'm Revel Airway, and this is Keyhole Witness. Hello, my friends, my fellow Keyhole Witnesses, and welcome back to another episode. This week, step out onto this limb with me. Let's suspend some disbelief together. I think I've gone a bit further than most of the versions told on this one. What I tell, I do not report, I merely tell. Hope you enjoy Sunglasses. Juan Celestino laid the receiver of the telephone gently into its cradle. That phone call had not gone as he'd hoped, but, well, he and Hernani didn't always see eye to eye. Hernani was often just too cold-headed, too logical. Juan Celestino knew that much of what he believed and said could rub most listeners the wrong way. The two old friends would surely find common ground in their next meeting. This quick quarrel would be swept away to where all their quarrels ended up, in that dustbin over there, full of what no one besides them wanted proven. Juan Celestino didn't have time right now to dwell on the conversation. He was giving a lecture this evening at the Café Rosa for the Electronics Guild of Campos dos Goitacazes, known by the members as the Secret Society of Scientific Spiritualism. These members were an odd lot of educated men, almost all of whom worked in communications electronics. Some repaired radios and televisions, others installed antennas. Juan Celestino himself had a large, popular home appliance shop where he sold all types of newfangled electronics. This evening he was going to present the theme that he and Hernani had just argued about in that phone call, had been arguing about for several weeks. The disagreement between the men was that Juan Celestino was going to present the theme before Hernani had finished experimenting with the hypotheses. Juan Celestino didn't believe he needed the experiments. He had first-hand experience, and though, according to Hernani, that experience was simply anecdotal, for Juan Celestino it was more than sufficient. It was also sufficient for the Electronics Guild, also known as the Secret Society. Juan Celestino was a popular speaker at these meetings, usually drew healthy crowds even from municipalities more than a stone's throw away, and he expected there would be at least a couple of dozen attendees very interested in his ideas. Juan Celestino had been slowly sowing his ideas and harvesting acolytes. The majority of the men attending the meetings were principally interested in using modern technology to make contact with the spiritual world, or as Juan Celestino disdainfully put it, building an electronic Ouija board. Juan Celestino often preached mainly to a satellite group within the larger group on the real future of scientific spiritualism, which was the establishment of communication with real beings that lived beyond the earth. He was convinced that there was a race of creatures on Mars, and that this race of creatures had been visiting the neighborhood. Sightings had been reported. The problem was always the same, though: how to establish two-way communication with these beings. Not so different a problem from that of communicating with long-dead Uncle Enrique or recently deceased Grandma Katrina. Two of the younger members, Manuel and Miguel, who had a small radio and antenna repair business, were especially open to Juan Celestino's ideas. They had been working on their own apparatus for communicating with non-terrestrial beings, a strange contraption made of several dozens of transistors and vacuum tubes and wires and solder, all housed in a rather large stainless steel coffee urn, the spigot replaced by a large switch and the little plastic handle in the center of the lid replaced with a red light. As Manuel would explain it, Miguel was the quiet one, the purpose of this apparatus was to create the connection with the Martians, not unlike a type of antenna. Once the two had proved through their experiments that the Martians could make contact through the apparatus, special radio equipment could then be connected and communication could begin. Juan Celestino thought this an admirable idea. However, there was one problem. Though he was convinced that the Martians were well advanced technologically from the humans, he doubted that the Martians would speak Portuguese, and no one on Earth spoke Martian. So, despite being able to exchange words over some type of radio device, one side would be unable to understand the other, and the other unable to understand the one. The idea of an advanced technological translation device simply didn't enter Juan Celestino's mind. Where Juan Celestino diverged from Manuel and Miguel's use of the apparatus was what should happen once contact was made, and he hoped to make contact with the two young men after the meeting this evening to convince them to meld their experiment with his. The room that Rosa had for these secretive, nearly clandestine meetings of the Electronics Guild of Campos dos Goitacazes, also known as the Secret Society of Scientific Spiritualism, was in the back section of the cafe, behind a carefully locked door, a door that only Rosa had the key to. Rosa respected the privacy of her clients, and only those who had ever attended any secretive, clandestine meeting in that room would have seen its interior. Others were unaware that the room existed. The men sitting in this handsome meeting room at the back of the Café Rosa on Rua Boa Morte applauded warmly as Celestino pronounced the conclusion of his presentation, smiled and bowed humbly in their direction. They had been particularly open to his thoughts this evening, but that could have been due to the calichivici liqueur that Celestino had asked Rosa to make flow freely. Now, as most of the audience were family men who would have to return to homes with wives who were surely waiting up for them, they began to gather around a coffee urn, which was suspiciously similar to the one Miguel had used when creating the apparatus, drinking coffee to attempt to sober up a bit before the walk or cab ride home. Juan Celestino saw this as his chance and approached the two young men, Miguel and Manuel, and asked them if he mightn't have a word with them semi-privately. The three had to be discreet. Other members of the society were often envious of any special attention Juan Celestino gave to any member. So the three could not just disappear from the assembly, could only edge quietly over to the end of the table on which the coffee and snacks were laid out, speak in low voices while smiling and nodding and occasionally laughing out loud as if a joke had been told. After just a few minutes of this charade, a meeting had been prepared for the next day, again here at Café Rosa. Most people would have had a hard time finding the Café Rosa. There was no hanging sign over the door jutting into the street, no large glass window, just a door with a tiny silver plaque on the left side of the frame that said Café Rosa. Even upon entering the place, one would wonder if it were a cafe. The entry was like that of any elegant home. A woman, who could have been a maid, could have been a waitress, but was actually Rosa herself, would take your coat, your hat, and ask who you were meeting, then either escort you to meet that person who was waiting inside, or take you to a table where you would wait for that person to arrive. Past that homey entrance area, the front saloon area of the cafe was more like a dark men's club. Little groups of comfortable chairs surrounding low round tables, standing ashtrays scattered about. Juan Celestino was waiting for the two young men. They joined him in sitting in comfortable chairs in a dark corner of the large room. The three men were alone. It was early in the day. The regulars who met at Café Rosa were still at their important executive jobs, in their offices, in their own meeting rooms. Juan Celestino began the conversation by asking about the younger men's recent experiments. Miguel really didn't like talking about this matter with others. He hardly talked about it with Manuel. He was the quiet one. So Manuel took the word and explained the incident on the beach. Juan Celestino knew about the earlier experiment in the back patio of Manuel's father's house, how the apparatus had first heated up, then the bottom had exploded out, leaving a small crater in the earth, and an angry father shouting at the two young men at the back door. He also knew that the two experimenters had been covered with a strange fluorescent powder, as had the earth around the crater in a circumference of more than a meter. All three men shared the opinion that that powder was somehow proof of some type of connection with the Martians, as an earthly origin for the glowing substance could not be identified, neither from the apparatus nor from the wounded Earth itself. Juan Celestino understood that that powder had marked the two young men in a special manner. The explosion in Manuel's father's patio did not deter the two from continuing their work, though. They had already prepared a slightly larger version of the apparatus. Experiments must be repeated, and they were already preparing the third, improved version in an even larger metal drum. Anyway, they'd taken this second apparatus out to the beach at around 10 at night. There was no one there to see them. They hooked it up to 3 car batteries they'd dragged along with them. The thing hummed. The thing heated up. This time the thing exploded hard enough to be heard 15 kilometers around. The fishermen working on their nets over on the dock swore that a burning, flaming object floating over the beach was what had exploded. Manuel and Miguel, caution learned from the early explosion, were fine. They'd drawn several yards away from the thing after turning it on. And, to their satisfaction, as they drew near the crater, they saw the sand covered with that glowing, fluorescent powder. Juan Celestino was very excited about this news. He told the young men that it was evident that their apparatus was a success. The reports from the fishermen confirmed that a vessel, probably from Mars, had been in the vicinity. Other sightings had been reported, and the young men's apparatus had caught the attention of the vessel's pilot. Contact had been made twice, in the back garden and then on the beach. But the Martian technology was obviously much more advanced. Force of the contact overloaded the apparatus, heating it to explosion, which in its turn demonstrated that, even had the men had a radio prepared, the apparatus was not prepared for transmission. And there was the problem of translation. Juan Celestino had a plan, though. Through his endless discussions with his friend Hernani, Juan Celestino had come to the conclusion that, as in the case of the electronic Ouija board, the real communication with Martians would not be carried out through technology, but rather, after initial contact using technology, through a direct communication of consciousness. That was evidenced by the fluorescent powder that had been produced in both cases. The apparatus was no longer needed. Manuel and Miguel had been marked. First contact had been made. The two simply hadn't realized it, or been able to take advantage of it. They were now programmed to enter into direct consciousness communication with the Martians. Juan Celestino began educating the two younger men by telling them how psychiatrists carrying out experiments with controlled substances had shown that a heightened consciousness could be artificially provoked in any man, making him more sensitive to energies most people were generally unaware of. The contact with the Martians was made up of just those types of usually invisible energies. Juan Celestino proposed to Manuel and Miguel that if they were willing to try, he could provide them with the drugs and the circumstances necessary to perhaps make a first communicative consciousness contact with the Martians. As the contact would be a direct melding of consciousness, there would be a direct understanding of thought between Earthlings and Martians. Language would be unnecessary, and communication could only be successful. Manuel and Miguel were especially indicated for this experiment as they'd been in contact twice. The Martians would surely recognize the men. Both had been marked by the Martian fluorescent powder. Miguel was not sure about this plan. He looked up from the electronic formula that he had been doodling onto a scrap of paper napkin and asked what were these drugs. Lysergic acid diethylamide, Juan Celestino pronounced carefully, an oft-used psychiatric drug that would open the young men's minds to Martian contact. Are these drugs safe? Juan Celestino assured Miguel that they were, while secretly chuckling to himself at this young man's innocence, not recognizing that he would be popping LSD. Better that way. An innocent mind is more open to believing that which is difficult to believe. Juan Celestino continued, telling them that later this summer they would need to bus to a town 6 hours away. Once there, they'd have to make it to the top of a hill in the middle of that town, where, following the pattern of recently reported sightings, a Martian spacecraft rendezvous would take place. As these Martian crafts were fairly large and incredibly bright, could only be looked at from afar, if the men were too close they might be blinded. They would have to be prepared with some type of eye protection. Juan Celestino suggested they craft for themselves some sunglasses from sheets of hammered lead, for example. Manuel said that would be no problem. He had the materials and the means in his workshop at the shop. Juan Celestino ended the meeting by handing the men a small scrap of paper with general instructions to follow. It was agreed that they would be in the indicated place at the indicated hour. Following those sighting patterns already mentioned, a sighting would take place at that place and at that hour. He handed the men a small package wrapped in newspaper and plastic wrap, told them that these were the augmented consciousness drug capsules that they were to ingest according to the instructions written on that scrap of paper. He also gave them a wad of bills, telling them that this was probably more than enough money to cover their expenses in carrying out the experiment. He finally assured them that if this experiment was as successful as theirs with the apparatus, they would be heralded by the secret society community as pioneers and discoverers. The three men parted ways after shaking hands on the street outside the Café Rosa. That meeting had been in late July 1960. Mid-August came and it was seasonably hot. Even so, both Manuel and Miguel dressed up very smartly. Slacks, white shirts, ties, wool jackets. They looked so professional. They told their wives that they were taking the bus to Rio to go purchase some electronic supplies from the warehouse there. They also planned on buying that car they'd been saving for, the car that would make their business grow by helping them do home visits and deliveries for their television and radio repair shop. They got on a bus at 9 o'clock that morning and arrived at about 3 that afternoon, not in Rio de Janeiro, as they'd lied to their spouses, but rather in Niterói. As they stepped off the bus in Niterói, Miguel looked at the sky and announced that it looked like rain. As he finished that proclamation, the clouds above them burst, and the two men ran, holding their hats onto their heads until they fortunately stopped under the awning over the show window of a men's clothing shop. They entered, brushed the water off their shoulders, and purchased 2 matching plastic raincoats. They went back out, saw a canteen that was open across the way, went over and had something to eat. Both were very hungry. They hadn't eaten since breakfast. Perhaps they ate too quickly. Manuel's lunch had left him a bit queasy. He wanted a bottle of mineral water to take with them, and as he paid for their lunch and signed a bottle return receipt for the water, Miguel checked his watch again and again. They were on a timetable, and they still had to walk to the hill and climb it and get prepared for the encounter, which included taking the drugs early enough for them to take effect before the arrival of the Martians. According to Juan Celestino's instructions, at 4:30 they needed to be at the top of the hill in town known as Morro do Vintém. At 6:30 they needed to take the drug. It was already nearly 4, and Miguel didn't like to hurry. A blonde foreigner sitting at the bar overheard Miguel trying to get Manuel to hurry up. With a strange accent, he told Miguel that if they needed, he could drop them off near the Morro do Vintém. He had his jeep parked just outside in the street. The two young men looked at one another and then, with a mutual shrug, accepted the offer. The blonde foreigner signaled to 2 other men at the bar, and all 5 stepped out into the now sunny afternoon, got in the jeep, and drove off. Getting this fortuitous ride certainly helped a lot. Manuel and Miguel jumped out of the jeep at the foot of the small hill, waved thanks to the blonde foreigner as he and his friends drove off, and they began the ascent, which was easy. There was a clear path, and they only had to walk up 42 meters, hardly a mountain adventure. Once at the top of the hill, only a half hour late, they discovered that the rains had left the ground very wet and somewhat muddy. Fortunately, over there was a large pile of palm leaves from a recent municipal pruning expedition up here. They dug under the top layer and were able to pull out several fronds that were dry, which they arranged on the ground, making a mat to sit on as they awaited the signal from the Martian spacecraft. Once the 2 men had made themselves comfortable atop the palm fronds, Manuel pulled the bottle of mineral water out of his bag and set it between them. He also pulled out that small package that Juan Celestino had given them. It was wrapped in a very thin plastic wrap. The wrap wound around a small piece of newspaper that was wrapped around two fairly large capsules. The men removed their watches, concerned about alien electronic charges and magnetic fields damaging them. Manuel pushed his watch into his front pants pocket. Miguel set his on the mat where he could control the time. Once the hands indicated that it was 6:15, he told Manuel to go ahead and get the capsules ready to take as he slipped his watch into the pocket of his jacket, which was folded on the mat to his left. Juan Celestino was an electronic appliance salesman, not a chemist. Nor was he a pharmacist, nor did he have the acquaintance of any chemist or pharmacist. When shopping around for the necessary drugs for the experiment, he had finally had to depend upon Miss Rosa of Café Rosa. She had contacts with many people who knew where such material could be had. Juan Celestino, who had had no personal contact with such drugs in his 68 years on this planet, told Rosa that he would need 2 units. Rosa's contact understood this to mean 2 capsules, which would normally be processed, first being dissolved in tea, then dosed by an eyedropper upon sugar cubes. Each capsule probably contained enough LSD for hundreds, if not thousands, of doses. Again, though, Celestino sold televisions and radios for a living. He knew practically nothing about LSD. He simply gave the 2 capsules to Manuel and Miguel and instructed them to take them at 6:30 and await the signal from the Martian craft. The 2 men took the capsules and reclined back onto the palm leaf mats. Manuel handed Miguel his beaten lead sunglasses, and the 2 men chuckled at how silly they must look. Both men began to feel a bit light-headed. Manuel thought he could see through the lead mask covering his eyes, but Miguel, who had always been the nervous, quiet one, took a quick, deep breath, felt his heart begin to race, and died of heart failure on the spot. Manuel died just a few minutes later, choking on his own lunch that had not settled well. Senora Gracinda Barbosa Cortino da Sousa, a well-to-do lady who had a fine house in the neighborhood of Morro de Vintem, had been driving home with 3 of her children. They were all suddenly blinded by a bright light from atop the hill. Gracinda stopped her car, and she and her children observed a large ovoid craft burning a bright yellow with orange flames around the edge, a seemingly bluish ray of energy reaching from the craft down to the top of the hill. Gracinda reported this to the police, who of course had to believe her. She was important in the community. And when the story got out to the press, others came forward. If Gracinda had seen it, who would be able to doubt? The 2 young antenna repairmen had been seen just as they had taken the pills. They would be seen again the next day, but would be assumed to be sleeping. They would lay on that damp ground, on those palm leaf mats, for another couple of days under the August sun, rapidly rotting to the point of reeking. The police would be called, but they'd take another day to reach the bodies. The bodies were examined, but only days later, after sitting in a morgue where the refrigeration had broken down and the workload had been heavy and delayed. By the time an autopsy was conducted, they were more soup than flesh. The doctor stomached a quick examination and ruled natural death, maybe exposure on the top of that hill. And when Manuel and Miguel were discovered on the top of the hill known as Morro do Vintem, they were, of course, woven into Gracinda Barbosa Coutinho da Sousa's UFO story. Or maybe her story was woven into the strange death of 2 young men from Goitacazes. Back in Goitacazes, Juan Celestino kept his peace, not even reporting to his friend Hernani. Though sightings had ceased since the discovery of the dead, the locals in Niterói just hung on to the story as something interesting to share with visiting friends and neighbors, and the occasional member of a secret society of scientific spiritualism who would show up from time to time for a few years after the event.
You're listening to Radio Revel. Listen, like, subscribe, and share.